The sun had barely crested over the Arizona Territory's jagged horizon when Eleanor Hayes watched the last of her father's cattle being driven away by men wearing badges that meant nothing to her broken heart. And she knew with bone-deep certainty that she had 48 hours before the bank took the ranch that had been in her family for 3 generations. She stood on the porch of the weathered ranch house, her cotton dress hanging loose on her frame from weeks of worried appetite, watching dust devils dance across the parched earth. It was June of 1882, and the drought had been merciless. Her father had died 4 months ago, trampled by a spooked horse during a lightning storm, and her mother had followed him to the grave just 6 weeks later, her heart simply giving out from grief. At 22 years old, Eleanor found herself alone with debts she could not pay and a property she could not keep. The cattle had been sold to cover some of what was owed, but it was not enough. It would never be enough. The bank wanted $800 by Friday morning, or they would take everything. Eleanor had $17.30 to her name. She walked back inside, her boots echoing on the wooden floorboards that her grandfather had laid with his own hands. The house felt enormous and empty without her parents. Photographs stared at her from the mantel, frozen moments of happier times when her father's laugh had filled these rooms, and her mother's singing had drifted from the kitchen. Eleanor traced her finger along the edge of her mother's favorite chair, fighting back tears she could no longer afford to shed. A knock at the door startled her from her grief. She was not expecting anyone. Most of the neighbors had stopped visiting after her mother died, uncomfortable with her solitary mourning or perhaps worried that financial misfortune might be contagious. She opened the door cautiously. A man stood on her porch, tall and lean with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer sky just before dusk. He held his hat in his hands, dusty brown hair falling across his forehead. He could not have been much older than she was, perhaps 25 or 26. His clothes were trail-worn but clean, and he wore a gun belt slung low on his hips in the manner of someone who knew how to use it. "Ma'am," he said, his voice soft and respectful. "I apologize for disturbing you. My name is James Cordell. My horse threw a shoe about 2 miles back, and I was hoping I might water him at your well before we make it into town. I will pay you for the trouble." Eleanor studied him for a moment. There was something honest in his face, something weary but kind in those blue eyes. "You do not need to pay me for water," she said quietly. "The well is around back. Help yourself." "Thank you, ma'am. I am grateful." He settled his hat back on his head and turned to leave, then paused. "If you do not mind my saying, you look like you could use a hand with something. I am pretty fair with repair work if you have need of it." She almost said no. Pride was about all she had left, but then she looked past him to the barn where the door hung crooked on its hinges and half the roof needed patching. What did pride matter when she was about to lose everything anyway? "The barn door," she heard herself say. "It has been broken since the spring storms, and there is a leak in the roof, but I cannot pay you. I have no money for hired help." James Cordell smiled, and it transformed his entire face, softening the hard edges that the trail had carved there. "Ma'am, I have been riding for near about 3 weeks straight. The company of another human being and maybe a hot meal would be payment enough for me. I am not looking for money." "I have stew from yesterday," Eleanor said slowly, "and bread I baked this morning." "That sounds like a feast to me," he replied. "Let me see to my horse and then I will take a look at that barn." She watched him lead his limping horse toward the well, his movements easy and confident. Something in her chest loosened slightly, just enough to draw a full breath. She could not remember the last time someone had offered her help without wanting something in return. Eleanor went inside and checked the stew, adding wood to the stove to warm it up properly. She set the table for 2, using her mother's good plates without quite knowing why. Through the window, she could see James examining the barn door, running his hands along the broken hinge. He disappeared into the barn and emerged a few minutes later with tools her father had left behind. She should have been out there helping him, but instead she found herself standing at the window, watching the way he worked with steady, methodical precision. He had removed his hat and his vest, working in just his shirt with his sleeves rolled up. There was something mesmerizing about watching someone competent at their work, someone who moved with purpose and skill. An hour later, he knocked at the door again, his face flushed from exertion. "The door is fixed and I patched the worst of the roof," he said. "It will need more work come fall, but it should hold through the summer rains." "Come in and wash up," Eleanor said. "The stew is ready." She watched him clean his hands at the basin, scrubbing away the dirt and grime of his work. He sat down at the table with a grateful sigh, and she ladled stew into his bowl, adding a thick slice of bread beside it. "This smells wonderful," he said. "I have been eating my own cooking for too long. A man can only eat so many burnt beans before he starts to lose faith." Despite everything, Eleanor felt a smile tug at her lips. "I am sure it was not that bad. Ma'am, I once set water on fire. I am not entirely sure how I managed it, but I did." He took a bite of the stew and closed his eyes in appreciation. "This is heaven." They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes. Eleanor found herself studying him between bites, noticing the small details. The scar above his left eyebrow, the calluses on his hands, the way he ate slowly, savoring every bite as if it might be his last good meal for a while. "Where are you headed?" she asked finally. "Prescott, originally," he said, "but I am not in any particular hurry. I have been drifting since I left Texas about 6 months back." "What were you doing in Texas?" "Working a ranch outside of San Antonio. Good outfit, good people." But the owner's son came back from the East with fancy ideas about modernizing everything, and he made it clear that those of us who had been there for years were not part of his vision. James shrugged. "So I collected my pay and hit the trail." "That must have been difficult," Eleanor said softly. "Leaving a place you had been for years. Sometimes staying is harder than leaving." He met her eyes across the table. "If you do not mind my asking, are you running this place alone?" The question hung in the air between them. Eleanor set down her spoon carefully, her appetite fading. "My father died in March, my mother in May. I have been trying to keep things going, but the drought killed most of the herd and I had debts I did not know about. The bank is foreclosing on Friday." She had not meant to tell him any of that. The words simply spilled out, carried on a tide of exhaustion and desperation she could no longer contain. James was quiet for a long moment. "I am sorry," he said finally, and the sincerity in his voice nearly broke her. "That is a heavy load for anyone to carry." "I have $17, Eleanor continued, the words coming faster now. "The bank wants $800. I sold everything I could sell. The cattle are gone. I have nothing left to give them except the land itself, and they are going to take that anyway. What will you do? I do not know." She felt tears burning behind her eyes but refused to let them fall. "I have an aunt in California who might take me in, or I could try to find work in Prescott, though I do not know who would hire a woman with no references and no skills beyond running a ranch." James pushed his empty bowl away and leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "How much work does this place need?" Eleanor blinked at the sudden change in subject. "I do not understand. You said the roof needs more work. What else needs fixing?" "Everything," she admitted. "The corral fence is falling down. The well pump needs repair. Half the windows do not close properly. The chicken coop has a hole that lets in coyotes. I have been trying to keep up with it, but every time I fix one thing, 2 more things break." And if all that was fixed, if the place was in good working order, would it be worth something to a buyer? "Maybe," Eleanor said slowly. "But I do not have time to fix it all before Friday, and even if I did, I do not have the skills or the money for materials." James stood and walked to the window, looking out at the ranch. "I have a proposition for you," he said after a moment. "Let me stay and help you fix this place up. I will work on getting it into shape, and in exchange, you give me meals and a place to sleep. When Friday comes, if you have to leave, at least you will leave knowing you did everything you could. And if by some miracle we can find a way to save it, then you will have a ranch worth keeping." Eleanor stared at him in disbelief. You would do that for a stranger. He turned back to face her, and there was something in his expression she could not quite name. Ma'am, I have been drifting for 6 months looking for somewhere that felt like it mattered. Maybe this is it. Maybe helping you is the first useful thing I will have done since I left Texas. And like I said, your company is payment enough for me. I cannot ask you to do that, Eleanor protested, even as hope flickered in her chest. You said you were heading to Prescott. Prescott will still be there next week, and the week after that. He smiled that transforming smile again. What do you say? Do we have a deal? She should say no. She should send him on his way and face her fate alone as she had been doing for months, but the thought of having help, of not being alone even for just a few days, was too tempting to resist. All right, Eleanor said quietly. But I help too. I am not going to sit in the house while you do all the work. I would not expect anything else, James replied. Partners, partners. They shook hands, and Eleanor felt the calluses on his palm press against hers. His grip was firm and warm, and for just a moment, she let herself believe that maybe, somehow, things might turn out all right after all. The next 2 days passed in a blur of activity. James proved to be as skilled as he had claimed, moving from one task to another with tireless efficiency. Eleanor worked beside him, holding boards while he hammered, passing him tools, mixing mortar for repairs. They fell into an easy rhythm, developing a wordless communication that came from shared purpose. They talked as they worked. James told her about growing up on a small farm in Missouri, about losing his parents to cholera when he was 16 and striking out on his own. He talked about the different ranches he had worked, the places he had seen, the people he had met. His stories were vivid and engaging, full of humor and hard-earned wisdom. Eleanor found herself talking too, sharing memories of her childhood on the ranch, of her father teaching her to ride and rope, of her mother's patient lessons in cooking and sewing and keeping a household running. She talked about the dreams she had once had, of expanding the herd and maybe starting a horse breeding program. Dreams that seemed impossibly distant now. Those do not have to stay dreams, James said as they worked on repairing the corral fence. Even if you lose this place, you could start again somewhere else. You have knowledge and experience. That is worth more than money. Starting again takes capital I do not have. Maybe, or maybe it just takes determination and the willingness to work hard. You have both of those in spades. She looked at him, this man who had ridden into her life just 2 days ago and somehow made her feel less alone than she had in months. Why are you doing this, really? You could be halfway to Prescott by now. James was quiet for a moment, his hands still on the fence post he was setting. Because everyone needs help sometimes, he said finally. And because you remind me of myself trying to hold together something that matters against impossible odds. And because... He paused, meeting her eyes. Because you are worth helping, Eleanor Hayes, and I think maybe you have forgotten that. Her breath caught in her throat. No one had said her name like that in so long with such warmth and certainty. Thank you, she whispered. No thanks needed. He went back to work, but she caught the slight smile on his face. By Thursday afternoon, the ranch looked better than it had in months. The barn was repaired, the corral secure, the worst of the maintenance issues addressed. James had even fixed the windows and patched the hole in the chicken coop. Eleanor walked around the property with something like pride, seeing her home through fresh eyes. But Friday was still coming, and $800 was still an impossible sum. They sat on the porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. Eleanor had made a good dinner, using the last of her supplies to create something special. If this was to be her last night in her family home, she wanted it to be memorable. I have been thinking, James said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. What if we went into town tomorrow morning and talked to the bank? Maybe if they saw all the work we have done, they might be willing to extend the deadline or work out some kind of payment arrangement. The bank manager is Marcus Thornton, Eleanor said bitterly. He went to school with my father, but that did not stop him from practically celebrating when he told me about the foreclosure. He wants this land. His brother-in-law is a developer from Denver, and they have plans to divide it up and sell it off in parcels. So it is not really about the money at all. No, it is about profit. My family's legacy is just an inconvenience to them. James was quiet for a long moment. Then we will find another way. There is no other way, Eleanor said, hearing the exhaustion in her own voice. I have been over this 100 times in my head. There is no solution. Tomorrow I will lose everything my family built, and there is nothing I can do about it. Do not give up yet, James said softly. We still have tonight. Miracles have happened with less time than that. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to have his optimism and faith. But she had been living with this hanging over her head for too long, and hope had become a luxury she could not afford. I need to ask you something, Eleanor said, turning to face him in the fading light. When this is over tomorrow, what will you do? Will you go on to Prescott? I have not thought that far ahead, James admitted. I suppose it depends on what you need. What I need is $800, she said with a hollow laugh. Since you do not have that in your pocket, I am afraid there is not much you can do. Eleanor. He reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle but firm. No matter what happens tomorrow, you are not alone in this. I want you to know that. I will be right there with you, and afterward, whatever you decide to do, wherever you decide to go, I will help you get there if you want me to. Why? The question came out barely above a whisper. You do not even know me. Why would you tie yourself to my problems? James held her gaze, and in his eyes, she saw something that made her heart race. Because in the last 3 days, I have felt more at home on this ranch with you than I have felt anywhere in the last 6 months. Because you are strong and brave, and you deserve better than what life has handed you. And because, he paused, then continued quietly, because I am halfway to falling in love with you, Eleanor Hayes, and that might make me a fool, but it is the truth. The world seemed to stop spinning. Eleanor stared at him, her hand still held in his, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. That is impossible, she breathed. We barely know each other. I know you wake up before dawn and check on the chickens first thing. I know you hum when you are cooking and you bite your lower lip when you are concentrating on something difficult. I know you are kind even when you have every reason to be bitter, and strong even when you are breaking inside. I know you care about doing things right, even when there is no one around to see, and I know that when you smile, really smile, it feels like the sun coming out after a storm. He squeezed her hand gently. Maybe that is not knowing everything, but it is knowing enough. Eleanor felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but this time she did not try to stop them. I am going to lose everything tomorrow. Maybe, but you have not lost me, not unless you want to. She leaned forward and rested her forehead against his shoulder, and his arms came around her, holding her close. They sat like that as the sky darkened and the stars emerged, holding onto each other as if they could stop the dawn from coming through sheer force of will. I do not want to lose you either, Eleanor whispered against his chest. That terrifies me almost as much as losing the ranch. Then you will not, James said firmly. I promise you that. They stayed on the porch long into the night, talking about everything and nothing. James told her about his dream of having his own small spread someday, just a few acres where he could raise horses and maybe some cattle. Eleanor talked about her mother's flower garden, now overgrown with weeds, and how she had always meant to restore it but never found the time. Eventually, exhaustion claimed them both. James insisted on sleeping in the barn despite Eleanor's protests that the house had a spare room. It would not be proper, he said with a gentle smile, and I want to respect your reputation. My reputation, Eleanor said wryly, is going to be that of a woman who lost her family's ranch to the bank. I do not think having a man sleep in the spare room would make it any worse. Even so, James said, the barn is comfortable enough and I have slept in far worse places. She did not argue further, but she gave him extra blankets and a pillow from the house. He thanked her with a kiss on her forehead that felt more intimate than anything else that had passed between them, and she went inside feeling like her heart was too big for her chest. Sleep did not come easily. Eleanor lay in her childhood bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about everything that had happened in the last 3 days. James Cordell had ridden into her life like something from one of the dime novels she used to read, and now she could not imagine facing tomorrow without him. Was it really possible to fall in love so quickly? It went against everything she had been taught about courtship and propriety and taking time to know someone properly. But then again, nothing about her situation was conventional. And James was right. She did know him in the ways that mattered. She knew his character, his kindness, his strength. She knew that he worked hard and kept his word and looked at her like she was worth something. She must have finally dozed off, because the next thing she knew, golden light was streaming through her window and birds were singing their morning songs. Friday had arrived. Eleanor dressed carefully in her best dress, a deep blue cotton that her mother had helped her sew 2 years ago. If she was going to lose her home, she would do it with her head held high and her dignity intact. She pinned up her hair, studying her reflection in the small mirror above her dresser. She looked older than her 22 years, she thought. Grief and worry had carved lines around her eyes and mouth. James was already up when she went outside, feeding his horse and checking the repairs they had made. He had shaved and cleaned up, looking more formal than she had seen him in their short acquaintance. "Good morning," he said, his expression serious. "How are you holding up, as well as can be expected?" Eleanor tried to smile. "Thank you for everything you have done. I know it will not change the outcome, but it meant the world to me that I did not have to face these last few days alone." "The day is not over yet," James said. "Do not give up until the final hand is played." They saddled up James's horse and the old mare that Eleanor kept for riding into town. The 8-mile journey to Prescott passed in heavy silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Eleanor tried to memorize the landscape, wondering if this would be the last time she saw these red rock formations, these ancient saguaros standing sentinel against the bright blue sky. Prescott was bustling with activity when they arrived, the streets crowded with wagons and riders and people going about their business. The bank sat on the corner of Montezuma Street, a solid brick building that looked far more permanent than anything around it. Eleanor felt her stomach clench as they tied up their horses outside. "I will be right beside you," James said quietly, offering her his arm. They walked inside together, and Eleanor asked to see Marcus Thornton. The clerk, a pinched-looking young man with wire-rimmed spectacles, informed them that Mr. Thornton was very busy and did not have time for walk-ins. "He will make time for me," Eleanor said firmly. "Tell him Eleanor Hayes is here regarding the foreclosure." The clerk scurried away and returned a moment later, gesturing for them to follow. Marcus Thornton's office was large and well-appointed, with a mahogany desk and leather chairs that spoke of wealth and influence. Thornton himself was a portly man in his 50s, with mutton-chop sideburns and cold eyes that assessed Eleanor like she was livestock at auction. "Miss Hayes," he said without standing, "I did not expect to see you here this morning. I assumed you would be packing your belongings." "I came to discuss the debt," Eleanor said, keeping her voice level. "The ranch has been substantially improved in the last few days. If you would agree to an extension of even a few months, I could find a buyer willing to pay enough to cover what is owed and leave me with something to start over." Thornton leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "The deadline was very clear, Miss Hayes. I have been more than generous in allowing you as much time as I have. The property will revert to the bank today as scheduled." "Be reasonable," James interjected. "Miss Hayes is trying to work with you. The least you can do is show some flexibility." "And who might you be?" Thornton asked, his tone dismissive. "James Cordell, a friend of Miss Hayes." "I see, a friend." Thornton's expression turned knowing and unpleasant. "How convenient that Miss Hayes has found herself a man just when her fortunes are at their lowest. Tell me, Mr. Cordell, did she promise you a share of the ranch if you could help her keep it?" Eleanor felt her face flush with anger and humiliation. "How dare you?" "I dare because I am the one holding the deed to your property, Miss Hayes. You come in here with your new friend and your requests for extensions, but the truth is quite simple. You owe this bank $800 and you do not have it. Your father overextended himself and now you are paying the price. That is the way of the world. My father built that ranch from nothing, Eleanor said, her voice shaking with emotion. He worked himself to death trying to keep it going, and you were supposed to be his friend. You went to school together, you were guests in our home. Business is business, Thornton said coldly. Sentiment does not pay debts. Now, if you will excuse me, I have paperwork to complete. You have until sundown to remove your personal belongings from the property. Anything left after that becomes the property of the bank. Eleanor felt the world tilting beneath her. This was really happening. There would be no reprieve, no last-minute miracle. Everything was over. James put his hand on her elbow, steadying her. Come on, he said quietly. Let us go. They walked out of the bank in silence. Eleanor felt numb, her mind refusing to process what had just happened. She had known this was coming, had prepared herself for it, but the reality was somehow worse than she had imagined. I need a minute, she said, her voice barely audible. James nodded and led her to a bench outside the general store. She sat down heavily, staring at nothing. It is over. It is really over. I am sorry, James said, sitting beside her. I know that does not help, but I am so sorry. They sat in silence for several minutes. People passed by, going about their ordinary day, oblivious to the fact that Eleanor's entire world had just collapsed. She watched them with detached curiosity, wondering what it felt like to have such simple concerns as shopping or visiting or conducting regular business. Miss Hayes. A voice interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to see a well-dressed man in his 40s standing before them, his hat in his hands. He had a weathered face but kind eyes, and he looked vaguely familiar, though she could not place him. Yes, Eleanor said dully. I am sorry to bother you, but I could not help overhearing in the bank just now. You are losing the Hayes Ranch. As of today, yes. The man glanced at James, then back at Eleanor. My name is Robert Carmichael. I own a freight company that operates between here and California. I knew your father, actually. He helped me out about 5 years back when one of my wagons broke down near your property. He and your ranch hands worked through the night to get it repaired, and he would not take a penny for it. Said neighbors helped neighbors, and that was the way of things. Eleanor felt tears prickling at her eyes. That sounded exactly like something her father would do. I never got the chance to properly repay that kindness, Carmichael continued. Your father passed before I could make good on my debt to him, but maybe I can help you now. How much do you need to keep the ranch? $800, Eleanor said, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. But I could not possibly accept that kind of money from you. I have no way to pay you back. Your father did not expect payment for his help, and I do not expect it for mine, Carmichael said firmly. Call it paying forward the kindness your family showed me when I needed it most. I cannot, Eleanor protested, even as hope flared painfully in her chest. That is too much. It would not be right, Carmichael smiled gently. Miss Hayes, I do very well for myself. $800 is a significant sum, but it is not a hardship for me, and it would mean the world to know that I helped preserve your family's legacy. Please, let me do this. Eleanor looked at James, who had been silent throughout this exchange. He nodded slightly, encouraging her. She turned back to Carmichael, her throat tight with emotion. I do not know what to say, she whispered. Say yes, Carmichael replied. And maybe someday, when you are back on your feet, you will help someone else who needs it. That is how my mother always said good deeds should work. They should spread like ripples in water. Yes, Eleanor said, her voice breaking. Yes, thank you so much, Carmichael smiled broadly. Excellent. Let us go back into that bank and give Marcus Thornton a surprise he will not soon forget. The next 20 minutes passed in a blur. Carmichael withdrew $800 in cash from his account and handed it to Eleanor. She walked back into Thornton's office with the money in her hands and the satisfaction of watching his smug expression crumble into shock. I am here to pay my debt in full, Eleanor said, counting out the bills onto his desk. I believe that means the ranch remains in my name. Thornton's face turned red, then purple. Where did you get this money? That is none of your concern, Eleanor said coolly. The debt is paid. I expect you to file the appropriate paperwork showing that the mortgage has been satisfied. This is highly irregular, Thornton sputtered. But entirely legal, Carmichael said from the doorway, his tone pleasant but his eyes hard. I trust there will not be any problems with the paperwork, Marcus. I would hate to have to mention to the Territorial Banking Commission that you seemed reluctant to accept payment on a debt. They might wonder why that was. Thornton looked like he had swallowed something sour, but he nodded curtly. The paperwork will be filed by end of business today. Excellent, Carmichael said. Miss Hayes, Mr. Cordell, shall we go celebrate your good fortune? They left the bank in a daze. Eleanor could not quite believe what had just happened. One moment she had been facing the loss of everything, and the next, a near stranger had saved her home with a generosity that defied understanding. I do not know how I will ever repay you, she said to Carmichael as they stood on the street outside. I told you, repayment is not necessary, but if you insist on doing something, there is one thing you could help me with. I am always looking for reliable way stations between here and California. If you were interested, I could contract with you to keep a few of my horses on your property and provide meals and lodging for my drivers when they pass through. It would not make you rich, but it would be steady income, enough to help you rebuild your herd. That would be wonderful, Eleanor said, hardly able to process this additional gift. Yes, absolutely, thank you. Carmichael tipped his hat to them both. I will have my lawyer draw up a contract and bring it by your ranch next week. In the meantime, congratulations on keeping your home. Your father would be proud. He walked away, disappearing into the crowd, and Eleanor turned to James with tears streaming down her face. I cannot believe that just happened. Believe it, James said, pulling her into his arms right there on the street. You get to keep your home. You get to keep your family's legacy. She buried her face against his chest, her body shaking with a combination of relief and joy and the release of months of accumulated tension. James held her tight, one hand stroking her hair, murmuring soft words of comfort and celebration. When she finally pulled back, she looked up at him with a tremulous smile. I guess you are stuck with me now. No noble exit helping the poor displaced woman find her way to California. Thank God for that, James said, grinning. I was not looking forward to California anyway, too many people. They rode back to the ranch in the golden afternoon light, and everything looked different to Eleanor now. The land was still hers. The house was still hers. The future was still hers to shape however she wanted. And beside her, riding with the easy grace of a man born to the saddle, was James Cordell, who had promised her she was not alone and had kept that promise. That evening they sat on the porch again, but this time the mood was entirely different. Eleanor felt lighter than she had in months, as if a tremendous weight had been lifted from her shoulders. They ate a simple dinner and talked about plans for the ranch, about how they could make the way station arrangement work, about eventually rebuilding the herd. I still cannot quite believe it, Eleanor said as the stars began to appear. This morning I thought I would be homeless by tonight. Now everything has changed. Not everything changed today, James said quietly. Some things started changing 3 days ago. Eleanor turned to look at him, her heart beginning to race. James, I meant what I said last night, he continued, holding her gaze. About falling in love with you, today's miracle does not change that. If anything, it makes it clearer. I want to stay, Eleanor. I want to help you build this place back up. I want to be here with you for as long as you will have me. You barely know me, she protested weakly, but her heart was not in the argument. I know enough. And I am willing to spend the rest of my life learning the rest if you will let me. Eleanor felt something give way inside her, the last of her protective walls crumbling. She reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. I was falling in love with you too. These last 3 days, having you here, working beside you, talking with you, it made me realize how lonely I had been. How much I needed someone who saw me as more than just a burden or a problem to be solved. You are not a burden, James said fiercely. You are the strongest, most remarkable woman I have ever met. She leaned toward him, and he met her halfway, their lips coming together in a kiss that was soft and sweet and full of promise. Eleanor felt tears on her cheeks again, but this time they were tears of joy, of relief, of a happiness so profound it almost hurt. When they finally pulled apart, James rested his forehead against hers. "Stay with me," she whispered. "Help me rebuild this place, make a home here." "There is nothing I want more," he replied. They sat together in the darkness, holding each other, watching the stars wheel overhead. Tomorrow they would begin the real work of restoration and rebuilding. But tonight, they simply savored the miracle of having found each other against all odds. Two lonely souls who had somehow become exactly what the other needed. The summer passed in a haze of hard work and growing love. James proved to be as devoted to the ranch as Eleanor had hoped, throwing himself into every task with tireless energy. They repaired fences and cleared irrigation ditches and prepared for Carmichael's freight drivers to start using the ranch as a way station. The first driver arrived in late July, a grizzled man named Pete who was delighted to have a real bed and a hot meal after weeks on the trail. He paid Eleanor for the service and tipped his hat to James, commenting that it was good to see the ranch being well cared for. More drivers followed, usually 1 or 2 a week, and the income began to add up. Eleanor used the money carefully, buying a few young cattle to start rebuilding the herd. James proved to be an excellent judge of livestock, helping her select animals with good conformation and breeding potential. They worked side by side from dawn until dusk, and Eleanor could not remember ever being so tired or so happy. Their relationship deepened with each passing day. James was courting her properly despite the fact that they lived on the same property, bringing her wildflowers he found on his rides and taking her into town on Sundays for church and socializing. The townspeople quickly accepted him as part of Eleanor's life, and if there was gossip about the propriety of their arrangement, it was muted by the obvious respect and affection they had for each other. In August, James rode into Prescott and returned with a small velvet box. He waited until evening, until they were sitting on their customary spot on the porch watching the sunset, before he pulled it out. "Eleanor Hayes," he said, dropping to one knee in front of her. "I know we have not known each other long by conventional standards. But I also know that I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you. I love your strength and your courage and your kindness. I love the way you sing to the chickens and the way you scrunch up your nose when you are thinking hard about something. I love the sound of your laugh and the warmth in your eyes when you look at me. I want to spend the rest of my life making you happy if you will let me. Will you marry me?" He opened the box, revealing a simple gold band with a small sapphire. "It is not much," he said. "But the stone matched your eyes, and I thought—" "Yes," Eleanor interrupted, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." James slipped the ring onto her finger and stood, pulling her into his arms and kissing her with a passion that took her breath away. When they finally broke apart, both of them were laughing and crying at once. "I love you," Eleanor said, framing his face with her hands. "I did not think I could ever be this happy again after losing my parents, but you brought me back to life, James Cordell. You gave me hope when I had none left." "You gave me a home," James replied softly, "a real home with someone to share it with. I have been drifting for so long, and now I finally know where I belong, right here, with you." They were married in September in the small church in Prescott with half the town in attendance. Robert Carmichael gave Eleanor away, standing in for the father he had known and admired. Eleanor wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved in a trunk, and James wore a new suit he had purchased for the occasion. They spoke their vows with steady voices and shining eyes, promising to love and honor and cherish each other for all the days of their lives. The ranch became their shared project, a labor of love that consumed their days and gave purpose to their lives. James proved to be everything Eleanor could have wanted in a partner. He was hardworking and devoted, but also tender and affectionate in private moments. They fell into an easy partnership, dividing tasks according to their strengths and supporting each other through challenges. The way station business grew steadily. Carmichael sent more drivers their way, and word spread among freighters that the Hayes Ranch was a good place to stop. Eleanor and James added a small bunkhouse to accommodate multiple drivers at once, and Eleanor's cooking became something of a legend among the men who traveled the California road. They bought more cattle through the fall and winter, carefully building their herd. James had a good eye for horses too, and by the spring of 1883 they had acquired several promising young mares that they planned to breed. The horse breeding program that Eleanor had once dreamed of was finally becoming a reality. Life was not without its challenges. The Arizona Territory was still wild and dangerous, with threats from drought and disease and the occasional outlaw. But Eleanor and James faced everything together, and that made all the difference. They learned each other's rhythms and moods, developed their own private jokes and rituals, built a life that was uniquely theirs. On their first anniversary, they sat on the porch as they had done so many times before, watching the sun set over land that had been in Eleanor's family for 3 generations and would now belong to their children someday. Do you ever regret it? Eleanor asked, her head resting on James's shoulder. Staying here instead of moving on to wherever you were headed? Not for a single second, James replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. This ranch, this life, everything we have built together, this is what I was looking for all along. I just did not know it until I found it. I love you, Eleanor said softly. I cannot imagine my life without you now. Good thing you will never have to, James said with a smile in his voice. They sat in comfortable silence as the sky darkened and the stars emerged. Eleanor thought about that day last June when James had ridden up to her door with a lame horse and an offer to help. She thought about how close she had come to losing everything and how a stranger's kindness had saved not just her home but her future. I want to start doing what Carmichael did, she said suddenly. Helping people who need it. We have steady income now and the herd is growing. I want to pay forward the kindness that was shown to me. I think that is a wonderful idea, James said. What did you have in mind? I do not know exactly, but I keep thinking about how alone I felt, how desperate, and I know there are other people out there feeling the same way. Maybe we could offer work to people who need it, or help someone who is struggling to keep their place, or just be there for people the way you were there for me. We will do it together, James promised. Whatever you want to do, however you want to help, I am with you, and he was. Over the years that followed, the Hayes Ranch became known as a place where people could find help when they needed it most. They hired drifters who needed work, gave loans to neighbors facing hard times, took in a few young people over the years who had nowhere else to go and taught them ranching skills they could use to make their own way in the world. In the spring of 1884, Eleanor realized she was pregnant. She told James one evening after dinner, watching nervously for his reaction. He stared at her for a long moment, then let out a whoop of joy that probably scared the horses. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing and crying at the same time. We are going to have a baby, he kept saying, as if he could not quite believe it. We are going to be parents. Their son was born in December, a healthy baby boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's dark hair. They named him Thomas after Eleanor's father. James proved to be a devoted father, getting up for nighttime feedings and changing diapers without complaint. Eleanor watched him with their son and fell in love with him all over again. Thomas was followed by a daughter 2 years later, whom they named Catherine after Eleanor's mother. And then another son 2 years after that, whom they named Robert after the man whose kindness had saved their home. The ranch house that had once felt so empty and echoing filled with the sounds of children laughing and playing. Through it all, Eleanor and James maintained the deep connection that had formed during those first desperate days. They still sat on the porch most evenings, watching the sunset and talking about their day. They still worked side by side on the ranch, though they now had hired hands to help with the heavy labor. They still looked at each other with wonder sometimes, marveling at the life they had built together. The years brought changes, as years always do. The Arizona Territory became the state of Arizona in 1912, and the Wild West that Eleanor and James had known gradually became more civilized. The railroad reached Prescott, bringing new opportunities and new challenges. The ranch continued to prosper, their cattle and horses earning a reputation for quality throughout the region. Eleanor often thought back to that June day in 1882, when James Cordell had ridden into her life. She thought about how she had stood on the porch of her family home, watching the last of her father's cattle being driven away, and believing that all hope was lost. She thought about the desperation and despair that had consumed her, the certainty that she was facing the end of everything that mattered. And then a stranger had knocked on her door, asking for water for his horse and offering to repair her barn in exchange for a meal. Such a simple thing, really. Such a small kindness, but it had changed the entire trajectory of her life. She remembered telling him she could not pay him, and she remembered his smile as he said those words that would echo through the rest of their lives together. "Your company is payment enough for me." He had meant it then, and he meant it still. Through decades of marriage, through raising children and building a legacy, through all the joys and sorrows that life brought them, James had never wavered in his devotion to her. And she had never stopped being grateful for the day he had chosen to stop at her ranch instead of riding on to whatever destination he had originally intended. They grew old together, their hair turning gray and their bodies slowing with age. They handed over more and more of the ranch operations to their children and grandchildren, content to spend their days in quieter pursuits. But they still sat on that porch every evening, weather permitting, watching the sun set over land they had loved and preserved together. On a warm evening in the spring of 1925, Eleanor and James celebrated their 42nd wedding anniversary. Their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a party, filling the house and yard with love and laughter. Eleanor, now 65 years old, looked around at the faces of the family she and James had created together, and felt her heart swell with gratitude. After everyone had gone home or retired to bed, she and James sat on the porch one more time, just the two of them in the darkness. 42 years, Eleanor said softly. "Can you believe it?" "Best 42 years of my life," James replied, taking her hand. His grip was not as strong as it once had been, but it was still warm and steady and sure. "Do you remember the day we met?" Eleanor asked. "You rode up with that lame horse and asked for water. How could I forget? It was the day my life really began." James smiled at her, his blue eyes still bright despite the years. "I was supposed to be heading to Prescott, you know. I had no intention of stopping at your ranch. But something made me turn down that road. Call it fate or divine intervention or just dumb luck, but I am grateful for it every single day." "I thought you were crazy," Eleanor admitted. "Offering to work for free, wanting nothing but company and a meal. I thought maybe you were simple or desperate or had some ulterior motive I could not figure out." "I was desperate," James said. "Just not in the way you thought. I had been drifting for so long, looking for something I could not name. And then I saw you standing on that porch, looking so strong and sad and determined, and I knew that I had found what I was looking for." Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder, fitting into the space that seemed made for her. "You saved me, you know, not just the ranch, though that too. But you saved me from giving up. You gave me a reason to keep fighting." "You saved me right back," James said softly. "You gave me a home, you gave me a family, you gave me a purpose. Everything good in my life came from that decision to stop at your ranch and offer to fix your barn." They sat in silence for a while, comfortable and content. 3 generations of their family slept under the roof of the ranch house and in the bunkhouse beyond. The cattle they had spent decades building into a quality herd grazed in pastures that stretched as far as the eye could see. The legacy that Eleanor's grandfather had started and her father had continued lived on, stronger than ever. "When I think about that day," Eleanor said eventually, "when Marcus Thornton told me I was losing everything, I remember feeling like the world was ending. Like there was no future worth having, and then you walked into my life and everything changed." "And then Robert Carmichael paid your father's kindness forward," James added. "Do not forget that part. That man's generosity saved your ranch." "Our ranch," Eleanor corrected gently. "It became ours the day you decided to stay." "Our ranch," James agreed. "And we paid that kindness forward too, over and over again through the years. How many people did we help, do you think?" "I lost count," Eleanor said with a soft laugh. "Dozens, maybe more. People who needed work, people who needed a loan, people who just needed someone to believe in them. Like Carmichael believed in you, like I believed in you. Like we believed in each other," Eleanor said firmly, more silence, peaceful and profound. An owl hooted somewhere in the darkness. A horse nickered softly from the barn, the sounds of the ranch that had been the soundtrack to their entire life together. "I need to tell you something," Eleanor said quietly. "Something I never properly said, even though I have shown it in 1,000 ways." "What is that?" "That day when you said my company was payment enough for you, when you asked for nothing but the chance to help me. That was the moment I started falling in love with you. I did not recognize it then. I was too buried in fear and grief to understand what I was feeling. But looking back, that was when it started. That moment of pure, uncomplicated kindness with no expectation of reward. That was when you captured my heart." James was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I said those words because they were true. I did not want your money or your gratitude. I just wanted to be near you, to help you, to maybe make your burden a little lighter, and somehow, miraculously, you let me. You let me into your life and your heart, and you gave me everything I had ever wanted without even knowing it." Eleanor turned to kiss him, a soft press of lips that held 42 years of love and commitment and partnership. "I would do it all again," she whispered. "Every moment, every challenge, every joy, all of it exactly the same as long as it meant spending my life with you." "Me too," James said simply. "Me too." They sat together until the moon rose high above the mountains, two people who had found each other against impossible odds and built a life that exceeded either of their wildest dreams. The ranch would continue after they were gone, passed down to children and grandchildren who would carry on the legacy of hard work and kindness, and paying forward the generosity that had been shown to them. But tonight, in this moment, it was just the two of them. Eleanor and James. A woman who had been days away from losing everything and a drifting cowboy who had stopped to offer help. Two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed, exactly when they needed it most. The years continued to unfold with the gentle rhythm of life well lived. James and Eleanor remained active in the ranch operations well into their 70s, though they increasingly relied on their children and grandchildren to handle the more physically demanding work. They became the beloved patriarch and matriarch of not just their family but the entire community, known for their wisdom and generosity. Thomas, their eldest, took over the primary management of the ranch in the late 1920s. He had inherited his father's skill with horses and his mother's business acumen, and under his leadership, the ranch continued to thrive even through the difficult years of the Great Depression. Catherine married a neighboring rancher and started her own family, though she visited her parents' ranch frequently. Robert, the youngest, became a veterinarian and provided care for the animals throughout the region, always giving his parents preferential treatment with a wink and a smile. The grandchildren adored Eleanor and James, begging for stories about the old days of the Arizona Territory, about outlaws and cattle drives and the wild frontier that existed before statehood. James proved to be a masterful storyteller, embellishing his tales with dramatic flair while Eleanor would laugh and correct his exaggerations. But when the grandchildren asked about how their grandparents met, both James and Eleanor would grow serious and tell the story exactly as it had happened, emphasizing the importance of kindness to strangers and the power of not giving up even when circumstances seemed hopeless. On their 50th wedding anniversary in 1933, the family threw an enormous party at the ranch. People came from all over the state to celebrate with them. Former hands who had worked for them over the years, neighbors they had helped through hard times, freight drivers who still remembered the hospitality of the Hayes Way station in its heyday. Robert Carmichael had passed away several years earlier, but his children attended, bringing with them a letter their father had written before his death, to be read at this occasion. Thomas stood before the assembled crowd and read the letter aloud. In it, Carmichael spoke about Thomas Hayes, Eleanor's father, and the kindness he had shown to a stranger. He spoke about the importance of paying forward good deeds and how his small act of generosity in 1882 had allowed the Hayes Ranch to continue and flourish. He spoke about Eleanor and James as examples of how two people could build something beautiful together when they approached life with love and dedication. By the time Thomas finished reading, there was not a dry eye in the crowd. James stood and pulled Eleanor up beside him, his arm around her waist. "I just want to say," he began, his voice still strong despite his 76 years, "that I am the luckiest man who ever lived. 50 years ago, I married the woman of my dreams, and every day since has been a gift. Eleanor, you made a drifting cowboy into a man with a home and a purpose. You gave me a family and a legacy. You showed me what it means to face adversity with grace and determination. And you loved me, even when I did not deserve it, with a devotion that humbles me every single day." Eleanor wiped tears from her eyes and reached up to cup James's face with her hand. "You deserve all of it and more," she said softly, though her voice carried across the silent crowd. "You taught me that I was not alone, that I did not have to face the world by myself. You showed me that asking for help is not weakness but wisdom, and you loved me with a selflessness and generosity that changed my life. These 50 years have been the greatest blessing I could have imagined." They kissed to thunderous applause and cheers, and the party continued late into the night with music and dancing and feasting. Eleanor and James held court like royalty, surrounded by the vast extended family they had created through blood and through the lives they had touched over 5 decades. As the years advanced into the late 1930s and early 1940s, James's health began to decline. Nothing dramatic at first, just the gradual slowing that came with advanced age. He moved a little more stiffly in the mornings, tired a little more easily in the afternoons. Eleanor, ever attentive, adjusted their routines to accommodate his changing needs. They took shorter walks and longer rests. They spent more time in rocking chairs on the porch and less time riding the property. Through it all, their love never diminished. If anything, it seemed to deepen with each passing day, refined by time into something pure and precious. They still held hands whenever they sat together. James still brought Eleanor wildflowers when he found them, though now they came from the garden rather than from long rides across the range. Eleanor still cooked James's favorite meals and laughed at his jokes, even the ones she had heard 100 times before. In the spring of 1945, as World War II was drawing to a close and the world was beginning to hope for peace, James suffered a stroke. He survived, but he was left weakened and largely confined to bed. Eleanor nursed him devotedly, rarely leaving his side. Their children tried to convince her to let them hire help, but she refused. "I took vows," she said firmly. "In sickness and in health, he took care of me when I needed it most. Now it is my turn to take care of him." James was lucid most of the time, though he tired easily. He and Eleanor spent long hours together in their bedroom, talking about their life and their memories. James made Eleanor promise that she would not mourn too long after he was gone, that she would continue to enjoy her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who had started arriving in recent years. "I want you to be happy," he said, his voice weak but earnest. "Promise me you will not just sit around being sad. Go to the grandchildren's school plays and the great-grandchildren's birthday parties. Keep sitting on that porch and watching the sunsets. Keep living, Eleanor. Keep being the amazing woman you have always been." "I promise," Eleanor said, tears streaming down her face. "But you have to promise me something too. Promise me you will wait for me. On the other side, wherever we go next, promise me you will be there waiting." "Always," James said, reaching up to touch her cheek. "I will be waiting on that porch, and when you arrive, we will watch the sunset together just like we always have." James Cordell passed away peacefully in his sleep on a warm June night in 1945, with Eleanor holding his hand and their children gathered around the bed. He was 88 years old, and he died as he had lived, surrounded by love. The funeral was enormous, attended by hundreds of people whose lives James and Eleanor had touched over more than 6 decades together. They buried him on a hillside overlooking the ranch with a view of the mountains he had loved. The headstone was simple: James Cordell, beloved husband, father, grandfather, and friend, 1857 to 1945. He made everyone's burden lighter. Eleanor grieved deeply but not destructively. She kept her promise to James, continuing to engage with her family and her community. She was still healthy and mobile at 85, and she threw herself into the lives of her grandchildren and great-grandchildren with renewed energy. But every evening, without fail, she sat on that porch in her rocking chair with James's empty chair beside her and watched the sunset alone. She lived for another 7 years, remaining sharp and engaged until nearly the end. She told stories about James to anyone who would listen, keeping his memory alive for the younger generations who had not known him in his prime. She continued to advocate for kindness and generosity, frequently reminding people about how one man's compassion had saved her family's ranch and changed the course of her life. On a summer evening in 1952, Eleanor Hayes Cordell passed away quietly in her sleep at the age of 92. Her children found her the next morning in her bed, a peaceful smile on her face, as if she had seen something wonderful in her final moments. On her nightstand was an old photograph from their wedding day, Eleanor in her mother's dress and James in his new suit, both of them young and radiant and full of hope. They buried her next to James on that hillside with a matching headstone: Eleanor Hayes Cordell, beloved wife, mother, grandmother, and friend, 1860 to 1952, she never gave up. The ranch continued under the management of their descendants, who maintained the traditions of hard work and generosity that James and Eleanor had established. The story of how they met became family legend, passed down through generations. The porch where they had spent so many evenings together was carefully preserved and maintained, and family members would often sit there in the evenings, watching the sunset and remembering the two people who had built the legacy they all enjoyed. In the years that followed, as the 20th century advanced and the world changed in ways that James and Eleanor could never have imagined, their great-great-grandchildren would sometimes ask about the old days. They would ask about the Wild West and the Arizona Territory, and what life was like before cars and televisions and all the modern conveniences. And the family would tell them about Eleanor Hayes, who faced losing everything at 22 years old and found the strength to keep fighting. They would tell them about James Cordell, the drifting cowboy who stopped to offer help and found a home. They would tell them about kindness and love and the power of not giving up even when all hope seems lost. But most of all, they would tell them about that moment on a porch in June of 1882, when a desperate young woman told a kind stranger that she could not pay him back for his help, and he smiled and said those words that would echo through generations: "Your company is payment enough for me." It was a simple statement, really. A small kindness offered freely with no expectation of reward, but it had changed everything. It had saved a ranch and created a family and built a legacy that would endure for over a century and beyond. It had proven that sometimes the most valuable things in life cannot be measured in money or possessions, but in connection and compassion and the willingness to help another human being when they need it most. And in that, perhaps, lay the true magic of Eleanor and James's story. Not in dramatic rescues or grand gestures, but in the quiet, profound truth that sometimes all another person needs is to know they are not alone. That their company, their presence, their existence in the world matters to someone else. That they are worth helping, worth fighting for, worth loving. The sun continued to set over the Hayes Ranch, painting the Arizona sky in shades of gold and crimson and purple, just as it had for over a century. The land endured, shaped by the hands of those who loved it. And somewhere, if you believed in such things, two souls sat on a porch together, watching that eternal sunset, their hands clasped and their hearts entwined for all of eternity. The story of Eleanor and James became more than just family history. It became a reminder that love can bloom in the most unexpected circumstances, that kindness creates ripples that extend far beyond the original act, and that sometimes the greatest treasures in life come not from what we acquire, but from what we freely give away. Their great-great-great-grandchildren still lived on portions of the original ranch in the early 21st century, though much had changed. The cattle operation had been modernized, the way station was long gone, and the Wild West that Eleanor and James had known existed only in history books and family stories. But the values they had instilled remained, passed down through generations like precious heirlooms. Every year on June 15th, the anniversary of the day James had first ridden up to the ranch, the extended family would gather for a reunion. They would share a meal and tell stories and take turns sitting on that carefully preserved porch, watching the sunset just as their ancestors had done. And someone, usually one of the elders, would stand and tell the story one more time, the story of how Eleanor Hayes stood on her porch and watched her world crumble, and how James Cordell rode into her life and helped her rebuild it. The story of how a stranger became a friend became a lover, and a lover became a life partner. The story of how $800 became 3 children, dozens of grandchildren, and generations of descendants who all owed their existence to one man's decision to stop and offer help, and one woman's courage in accepting it. The story of how the most important things in life often come disguised as small moments, chance encounters, and simple acts of human decency. The story of how love, when it is real and true and deep, can transform not just 2 lives but everyone those lives touch, spreading outward like light from a candle, illuminating the darkness and making the world a little bit brighter. And at the end of the telling, someone would always raise a glass and offer the same toast that had become tradition. To Eleanor and James, who taught us that the best payment anyone can offer is their company, their loyalty, and their love. The family would echo the toast, glasses clinking in the gathering dusk, and if you listened very carefully over the sound of laughter and conversation and the distant lowing of cattle, you might hear something else. The creak of rocking chairs on old wood. The soft murmur of 2 voices, comfortable and content. The sound of a love that had transcended death itself, living on in the land they had preserved and the family they had created and the legacy they had built together. Because some stories do not end when the people in them die. Some stories become eternal, woven into the fabric of the world itself. And the story of Eleanor Hayes and James Cordell was one of those stories, a testament to the enduring power of love, kindness, and the simple truth that sometimes the most valuable thing one person can give another is themselves, freely and without reservation. The ranch stood as it had for over a century and a half, a monument to their love and their lives. The sun set and rose, the seasons turned, and time marched relentlessly forward. But there on that hillside, 2 headstones stood side by side, weathered by time but enduring, just like the love they commemorated. And if you visited that spot at sunset, when the light painted the world in shades of amber and gold, you might feel something special in the air. A sense of peace and completion. A whisper of something profound and true. The lingering presence of two souls who had found each other when they needed it most and had never let go. Eleanor and James had built more than a ranch. They had built a life, a family, and a legacy of love that would continue long after the buildings crumbled and the land changed hands. They had proven that one moment of kindness can alter the course of history, that one decision to help a stranger can create ripples that extend across generations. And most importantly, they had shown that, when someone says your company is payment enough, when someone values your presence over any material reward, that is when you know you have found something precious and rare. That is when you know you have found love in its truest, purest form. The story ended as all good stories do, with love triumphant and legacy secure and the certainty that what had been built would endure. Eleanor and James had lived fully, loved deeply, and left the world better than they found it. They had faced adversity with courage, greeted opportunity with gratitude, and treated each day as the gift it was. And somewhere, perhaps, they were still sitting on that porch, hands clasped and hearts content, watching an eternal sunset over the land they had loved together. Still partners. Still friends. Still deeply, profoundly, eternally in love, because that is what happens when you build a love on a foundation of kindness, respect, and genuine care for another person's well-being. It does not fade with time or diminish with hardship. It only grows stronger, more precious, more beautiful. Eleanor and James had known this truth from the very beginning, from that first moment on a June day in 1882, when he had offered his help, and she had accepted it. They had built their entire life on that foundation, and it had held firm through every storm. Their story was over, but the love remained. In the land, in the family, in the values they had instilled and the lessons they had taught. In the simple truth that the best things in life cannot be bought or sold, only given freely from one heart to another. And in that truth lay their immortality, their eternal legacy, their gift to all who came after them. The knowledge that love, kindness, and human connection are the only currencies that truly matter. That helping another person when they need it most is the highest calling anyone can answer. And that sometimes, the greatest reward for any action is simply the company of someone who matters, the smile of someone you love, and the knowledge that you made a difference in another person's life. The sun set one final time over the Hayes Ranch in this telling, painting the sky in glory. Two empty rocking chairs swayed gently in the evening breeze, as if recently vacated, and the land itself seemed to hold its breath, honoring the memory of two people who had loved it well and left it better than they found it. Eleanor Hayes and James Cordell. A woman who refused to give up and a man who chose to help her. A love story for the ages, a testament to the human spirit. A reminder that sometimes, when everything seems lost, salvation arrives in the form of a stranger with kind eyes and a generous heart. And the greatest truth of all, that when love is real, when connection is genuine, when two people truly see and value each other, no payment is necessary. The company, the partnership, the shared journey through life is reward enough for anyone. That was their story. That was their legacy. That was the gift they gave to all who knew them and all who would come after. And it was, in every sense that mattered, a story with a perfect ending. Not because life was always easy or because challenges never came, but because they faced everything together, and that made all the difference. The end of their individual lives was just the beginning of their eternal story, one that would be told and retold as long as people valued love, kindness, and the courage to help another human being when they need it most. Eleanor and James had found each other across impossible odds, built a life together against all obstacles, and created a love that death itself could not diminish. And really, what more could anyone ask for than that?